but I had worked several other films before that, but with just small.
When Gene Hackman's Embalmer finally came forward, nobody was prepared for what they confirmed. For weeks after his death, the public had been left with questions. Fragments of a story that didn't quite add up. Investigators had already uncovered details that raised eyebrows. But it was the person who handled Hackman's remains who put the final, stunning piece into place. What they revealed wasn't just about how he died. It was about what his body had quietly been carrying for years. Something that changed the entire picture of his final chapter. The pain that built Gene. Gene Hackman never looked like the kind of actor Hollywood usually turned into a leading man. He wasn't polished or conventionally handsome. He was rough around the edges, carried a weathered look, and had to fight for every opportunity that came his way. But that relentless struggle ended up becoming one of his greatest strengths. The frustration, anger, and heartbreak he carried for years gave his performances a level of authenticity that few actors could match. It helped create some of the most unforgettable characters in film history. At the same time, that same intensity often spilled over into his personal life and behind the scenes, leading to more than a few explosive moments. To understand where all that fire came from, it helps to go back to Gene's childhood. His early years were marked by a painful betrayal that stayed with him for the rest of his life. After years of mistreating the family, his father simply packed up and left. Gene was only 13 years old. The moment never left him. Years later, he recalled watching his father drive away, casually raising a hand to wave goodbye from the car as if nothing had happened. That simple gesture hurt more than words ever could. One day, Hackman would learn how to channel that pain into his craft. But getting there was anything but easy. As the years passed, his behavior started heading in the wrong direction. Movies became his only real escape, especially the trips he took to the theater with his mother. Outside of that, life was filled with anger and frustration. He became rebellious, constantly challenged authority, and often found himself in trouble. At one point, he even spent a night in jail after being caught stealing candy and a soda from a neighborhood store. So when the moment came that seemed like it might change his life, it wasn't exactly the fresh start anyone would have hoped for. At just 16 years old, restless and eager to escape the life he knew, Hackman enlisted in the Marines. Instead of giving him direction, the experience only magnified his rebellious streak. He argued with superiors, got into frequent confrontations, and quickly developed a reputation as someone who refused to follow the rules. His commanding officers had little patience for him. Then, things took another turn for the worse. In the early 1950s, he was involved in a serious motorcycle accident that left him with a broken leg. The injury ultimately brought his military career to an end, and he was discharged. At 22 years old, Hackman suddenly found himself back at square one, unsure of what came next. But sometimes the lowest points end up pointing people toward their true calling. Thinking back to all those afternoons spent watching movies with his mother, he decided to head to New York and take a chance on acting. The dream sounded exciting. The reality was much harsher. New York didn't offer instant opportunities or glamorous auditions. Instead, Hackman bounced from one exhausting job to another just to pay the bills. One of the lowest moments came when he worked nights in the Chrysler Building, polishing the leather chairs used by corporate executives while wondering if his own future would ever change. As discouraging as that was, an even tougher moment was still waiting around the corner. In 1955, Hackman was earning a living as a doorman at a hotel in Times Square when fate caught up with him in the most painful way. One day, one of his former Marine drill instructors happened to walk past the entrance. The man had never thought much of his former recruit. and seeing him standing there in a doorman's uniform only confirmed his opinion. Without even making eye contact, the former sergeant reportedly muttered an insult as he walked by, loud enough for Hackman to hear. It was a humiliating moment, but instead of breaking him, it sparked something inside him. Hackman had spent most of his life being underestimated. People had dismissed him, criticized him, and repeatedly told him he wasn't good enough. Later, during an interview with David Letterman, he admitted that the encounter embarrassed him deeply. He hated that his old drill instructor had seen him stuck in a dead-end job. But rather than letting the insult define him, Hackman used it as motivation. Every doubt, every criticism, and every person who said he would never make it became fuel that pushed him to keep going. Even then, he still needed one more person to believe in him before everything truly began to change. Around that time, Hackman was dating a woman named Faye Maltese. While many others questioned his future, Faye believed he had real potential. The two married in 1956 and eventually raised 3 children together. More importantly, she encouraged him to take a chance on himself by enrolling at the Pasadena Playhouse to study acting. It sounded like the opportunity he had been searching for. Instead, it became another uphill battle. At 26 years old, Hackman was much older than most of his classmates, many of whom were only 19. He later joked that while they looked like walking surfboards, he looked more like an everyday mine worker. Once again, he felt like he didn't belong. The age gap wasn't the only problem. His old habit of clashing with authority followed him into acting school. Hackman frequently argued with instructors, and they weren't shy about letting him know what they thought of him. Some openly mocked him, and one teacher even told him he would never amount to anything. By the time his time at the Pasadena Playhouse came to an end, Hackman had earned the lowest grade the school had ever given a student. Still, amid all the criticism and rejection, there was one classmate he genuinely connected with. That friendship would prove to be unforgettable because the young man sitting beside him was also destined to become one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Success couldn't silence his doubts. At the Pasadena Playhouse, Hackman never really fit in. He was older than most of the students, clashed with his instructors, and often felt like an outsider. Still, amid all the rejection, he found one person who understood exactly how that felt. It was another awkward student who seemed just as out of place as he was, a 19-year-old named Dustin Hoffman. The two couldn't have looked less like future movie stars. Hoffman embraced the beatnik lifestyle, often showing up in a suede vest and sandals, while Hackman carried the rugged look of someone who had spent years doing hard labor. Together, they became an unlikely duo. During breaks, they would head up to the roof, playing bongos and talking about acting, while most of their classmates kept their distance. Before graduation, the class even voted both of them the students least likely to succeed. It was a prediction that couldn't have been more wrong. Hackman refused to let anyone else's opinion define him. By 1961, he had started landing small roles in film and television, slowly building experience one job at a time. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. In 1967, he was cast as Buck Barrow in Bonnie and Clyde, starring alongside Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and for the first time in his life, strangers began recognizing him wherever he went. After years of being overlooked, success had finally arrived. But just as his career was beginning to take shape, life dealt him another heartbreaking blow. Back in 1962, while Hackman was still struggling to establish himself as an actor, and years before Bonnie and Clyde made him a star, his mother died in a tragic house fire that reportedly began when a lit cigarette accidentally ignited the home. The loss devastated him. She had been the person who introduced him to movies and unknowingly planted the seed that would one day become his career. Now, the woman who had inspired that dream was gone before she ever got the chance to see it come true. The grief settled deep inside him, adding another layer to the emotional weight he had carried since childhood. Around the same time, Hackman threw himself completely into method acting. It wasn't just something he practiced during rehearsals. It became part of how he lived. In his 30s, he would walk the streets of New York, quietly observing complete strangers, studying the smallest details of how they moved, spoke, and reacted. Every habit, every gesture, every expression became something he stored away, hoping it might help bring a future character to life. That dedication would soon pay off. In 1971, Hackman landed the lead role in The French Connection, playing the relentless and unpredictable detective Popeye Doyle. The gritty crime thriller featured one of the most celebrated car chases ever filmed, and Hackman's fearless performance earned him the Academy Award for Best Actor. From the outside, it looked like another huge victory. Behind the scenes, it was anything but. Director William Friedkin never wanted Hackman for the role in the first place. Before settling on him, Friedkin had approached several of Hollywood's biggest tough guy stars, including Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, and Charles Bronson. One by one, they turned the role down. Only then did Hackman get the call. He knew exactly where he stood. Hackman later joked that he had been somewhere around the 7th choice to play Popeye Doyle. Instead of ignoring that fact, he carried it with him throughout production. The knowledge that he hadn't been anyone's first pick only fueled the insecurity and frustration he had spent years trying to outrun. The demanding shoot didn't make things any easier. The film required brutal fight scenes, intense physical performances, and long, exhausting days. At one point, Hackman became so worn down that he even suggested Friedkin should replace him. Fortunately, the director didn't. Even after winning an Oscar, though, Hackman couldn't shake the feeling that he was always standing in someone else's shadow. That mindset resurfaced a few years later when he starred in Francis Ford Coppola's 1974 thriller, The Conversation. It eventually became one of Hackman's favorite films. But during production, he learned that Coppola had originally wanted Marlon Brando for the lead role. For many actors, that would have been easy to shrug off. After all, Brando was one of the biggest stars in the world. Hackman saw it differently. Once again, he turned rejection into motivation. Every ounce of disappointment, every lingering insecurity, and every feeling of not being good enough found its way into the character. The result was another deeply layered performance that remains one of the finest of his career. But living off that kind of emotional fuel came with a cost. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Hackman had become one of Hollywood's biggest stars, yet he struggled to adjust to the life that came with fame. Success brought enormous paychecks, and he spent money just as quickly as he earned it. Private planes, expensive cars, and every luxury imaginable became part of his lifestyle. Eventually, the bills caught up with him. Financial pressure forced Hackman into taking roles he might otherwise have turned down. Some of the films from that period failed to connect with audiences, leaving little impact on his career. At one point, his situation became so difficult that he reportedly drove his daughter's beat-up old car to job interviews because he had nothing else available. For a man who had climbed so far, it was another painful reminder that success could disappear just as quickly as it arrived. And before long, an even bigger challenge was waiting just around the corner. Why everyone feared working with him. By 1981, Gene Hackman was already watching his finances spiral out of control, but money soon became the least of his worries. Out of nowhere, tragedy struck when his closest friend, Norman Gary, died by suicide. Hackman had always been a private man who kept his circle small, so losing Norman left an enormous hole in his life. One of the few people he truly leaned on was suddenly gone. Just when he needed something solid to hold on to, another part of his life fell apart. 5 years later, his marriage to Faye Maltese finally came to an end. After 3 decades together, the relationship had been struggling for years, and in 1986 the couple divorced. It was another crushing loss for Hackman, who later admitted that he had become so discouraged he seriously considered walking away from acting for good. What he couldn't see at the time was that some of the greatest performances of his career were still ahead of him. Plenty of actors never recover after a stretch like that. Hackman did. In 1988, he starred opposite Willem Dafoe in the powerful civil rights drama Mississippi Burning, playing a determined FBI agent investigating a series of murders in the American South. The performance reminded everyone why he was one of the finest actors of his generation and earned him another Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Professionally, he was back on top. Personally, though, he remained as guarded as ever. The emotional weight of the role seemed to push him even further inward. While filming, Hackman kept almost entirely to himself, revealing very little about who he was away from the camera. His co-star, Frances McDormand, later remarked that he had an extraordinary ability to keep every part of himself hidden, even during rehearsals. For years, that privacy extended to his personal life, but it wasn't going to stay that way forever. In 1991, news broke that surprised many people. Hackman had fallen in love again and married concert pianist Betsy Arakawa, who was more than 3 decades younger than he was. The couple would spend the rest of their lives together, remaining devoted to one another until their tragic deaths many years later. While his personal life had found new stability, Hackman himself still hadn't completely escaped the frustrations that had followed him for decades. By 1992, he had reached legendary status in Hollywood. So when Clint Eastwood offered him the role of the ruthless Sheriff Little Bill Daggett in Unforgiven, it seemed like the perfect fit. Then Hackman arrived on set and immediately found himself battling old emotions all over again. One of his co-stars was Richard Harris, whom Hackman had worked with years earlier on the 1966 film Hawaii. Hackman recognized Harris instantly, but it became clear that Harris had no memory of him. To most people, that might have been a minor slight. To Hackman, who had spent a lifetime feeling overlooked, it struck a nerve. That frustration stayed with him while filming one of the movie's most brutal scenes, where Sheriff Daggett violently beats Harris's character. Years later, Hackman admitted that he deliberately channeled his real-life disappointment into the performance, using those lingering emotions to make the scene feel as authentic as possible. It wasn't exactly the healthiest acting technique, but it was one of the reasons directors loved working with him. Filmmaker Alan Parker, who had directed Hackman in Mississippi Burning, once observed that every director had a short list of actors they dreamed of working with, and Gene Hackman was almost certainly on all of them. That reputation inspired a young Wes Anderson while writing The Royal Tenenbaums in 2001. Anderson created the role of Royal Tenenbaums specifically with Hackman in mind. There was only one problem. Hackman wanted nothing to do with it. At the time, Anderson was one of Hollywood's fastest-rising directors, and the cast already included stars such as Angelica Houston. Even so, Hackman immediately rejected the offer. More than that, he reportedly disliked the idea that Anderson had written the character specifically for him, believing it suggested the director thought he understood him personally. There may have been another reason as well. Hackman later admitted that Royal reminded him of uncomfortable parts of himself. He worried the character's strained relationship with his family echoed mistakes he believed he had made with Fay Maltese and their children. He wasn't eager for them to watch what felt like an uncomfortably familiar portrayal. Wes Anderson, however, had a different perspective. According to the director, the biggest obstacle wasn't the emotional connection to the role, but the paycheck. The Royal Tenenbaums had assembled such an impressive cast that everyone involved agreed to work for significantly less than their normal salaries. Hackman wasn't thrilled about taking that kind of pay cut, and Anderson believed that played a major role in the repeated refusals. Neither man was especially stubborn enough to back down. Anderson simply refused to give up. Even after considering respected actors like Michael Caine and Gene Wilder as possible replacements, he kept returning to Hackman. He continued calling, continued asking, and continued insisting that no one else could play Royal the way Hackman could. Eventually, Hackman gave in. It turned out to be a decision that made for an unforgettable film, but not an easy production. From the moment filming began, Hackman carried visible resentment onto the set. He frequently clashed with Wes Anderson, openly criticizing the young director and, according to several cast members, insulting him in front of everyone. Part of the tension came down to personality. Hackman had been shaped by years of military discipline, manual labor, and hard-earned success. Anderson, by contrast, had a softer, more meticulous style. Hackman struggled with taking direction from someone so different from himself, even though Anderson was simply doing his job. Instead of accepting the dynamic, Hackman often talked down to him. Anjelica Huston later recalled that Hackman once told Anderson to pull up his pants and act like a man. The atmosphere became so uncomfortable that another member of the cast stepped in. Bill Murray, a longtime friend and collaborator of Anderson's, reportedly began showing up on set even when he wasn't scheduled to work. According to those involved, he wanted to make sure the young director wasn't left to deal with Hackman's temper on his own. Even then, tensions kept bubbling to the surface. Hackman's biggest source of frustration eventually shifted away from Anderson and toward Luke Wilson. During filming, Wilson reportedly had a major crush on Gwyneth Paltrow, who played his love interest in the film. Cast members later suggested that Wilson sometimes became flustered during scenes with her, leading to extra takes. For Hackman, who prided himself on preparation and efficiency, the repeated delays became increasingly irritating. Although people often said Hackman was toughest on the men around him, that didn't mean the women escaped the intensity either. Anjelica Huston remembered that their very first scene together required her to slap Hackman across the face. She delivered the hit with such force that she could see the outline of her hand left on his cheek. For a moment, she genuinely wondered whether he might lose his temper. Despite all the arguments, tension, and behind-the-scenes clashes, the Royal Tenenbaums went on to become one of the defining performances of Hackman's remarkable career. What no one realized at the time was that it would also stand as one of the final great roles from one of Hollywood's most unforgettable actors. The final chapter, nobody expected. After the Royal Tenenbaums, Gene Hackman's time on the big screen was coming to an end. He appeared in only 2 more films: Runaway Jury, where he finally shared the screen with his longtime friend Dustin Hoffman, and Welcome to Mooseport. Then, in 2004, during an interview with Larry King, Hackman quietly revealed that he believed his acting career was over. It wasn't a temporary break or a passing thought. He was finished. From that point on, he never returned to star in another major film. Retirement may have marked the end of his Hollywood career, but it certainly didn't mean life became quiet. The fierce, combative streak that had followed Hackman for decades never really disappeared. Even in his 70s, he still had a habit of letting his temper get the better of him. One incident in December 2001 made that perfectly clear. Around the same time the Royal Tenenbaums was reaching theaters, Hackman was involved in what should have been nothing more than a minor traffic accident in West Hollywood. For most people, it would have ended with exchanging insurance information. Not for Gene Hackman. Instead of calmly sorting things out, the confrontation quickly became physical. Hackman later admitted that after the other driver brushed against him, he threw a punch. Before long, the two men were wrestling on the pavement until police arrived and broke up the fight. Looking back on the incident, Hackman seemed almost amused, later recalling that he had managed to land a few solid punches. It was yet another reminder that age had done little to soften him. Ironically, despite his reputation for throwing himself into dangerous situations, Hackman remained remarkably healthy for most of his life. His biggest medical scare came in 1990, when heart problems led to an angioplasty at the age of 60. Fortunately, the procedure was successful, and he went on to enjoy decades of relatively good health. Still, there were moments when that good fortune was seriously tested. Hackman had always enjoyed adventure. During the late 1970s, he developed a passion for motorsports, even competing in endurance racing events. He was also an avid deep-sea diver. As he grew older, those hobbies gradually gave way to something a little less extreme, or at least it seemed that way. Cycling became his new obsession, and he approached it with the same fearless attitude he brought to everything else. That fearlessness nearly cost him his life. In 2012, at 81 years old, Hackman was riding his bicycle through the Florida Keys when a pickup truck struck him. Making matters worse, he wasn't wearing a helmet. Early news reports described the accident as serious and suggested he had suffered significant injuries. Thankfully, the reality turned out to be far less severe. Hackman's publicist quickly reassured everyone that he had escaped with only minor bumps and bruises and was already heading home from the hospital. Even the accident wasn't enough to convince him to slow down. Friends and neighbors continued spotting him riding his bicycle well into his 90s. For all the stories about Hackman's temper, not every experience on set was filled with conflict. While filming the 1973 road movie Scarecrow, he built a genuine friendship with his co-star, Al Pacino. The two respected each other's craft, and both were deeply committed method actors, which often led them into some unusual situations. Determined to understand the lives of the wandering drifters they portrayed, Hackman and Pacino spent time walking through the streets of San Francisco, fully immersed in character. During one outing, they approached a homeless man and asked for directions without breaking their performances. After he pointed them the right way, they thanked him, only for the man to casually respond by calling them Mr. Hackman and Mr. Pacino. He had recognized them from the very beginning. It was a funny reminder that even the most committed performances couldn't always fool the public. Another method acting experience, however, came much closer to ending in disaster. While preparing for The French Connection, director William Friedkin arranged for retired police officers to serve as consultants. And Hackman, along with co-star Roy Scheider, spent weeks riding alongside real detectives to observe how they worked. The idea was simple: watch, listen, and learn. Hackman had other ideas. During one patrol, officers moved in to arrest a suspect. So immersed was Hackman in the mindset of Popeye Doyle that he instinctively jumped into the operation himself. Before anyone could stop him, he helped restrain the suspect and even shoved the man into the back of the police car. The problem, of course, was that Hackman wasn't actually a police officer. He later admitted he feared legal consequences after realizing what he had done. Fortunately, no lawsuit ever followed, and the bizarre incident became another unforgettable story from his career. As unusual as that was, perhaps the most revealing insight into Hackman's personality came years later from someone who knew him better than almost anyone else. Dustin Hoffman once claimed that Hackman seemed to have an almost uncontrollable urge to get into fights. According to Hoffman, they could be spending an ordinary evening together when Hackman would suddenly decide to leave, heading to a neighborhood bar because he felt compelled to get into a confrontation. Whether exaggerated or not, the story fit the image many people already had of him, a man whose inner fire never completely faded. Then came the chapter no one expected. On February 26, 2025, a maintenance worker arrived at Hackman's home after becoming concerned that no one had answered repeated knocks at the door. With Gene Hackman, now 95 years old, and Betsy Arakawa, 64, the silence felt unusual. Security personnel and law enforcement were called, and officers eventually entered the home. Inside, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Hackman had died. But he wasn't alone. His wife, Betsy Arakawa, was also found dead inside the house, along with one of their 3 dogs. It quickly became apparent that they had been deceased for some time. As investigators pieced together the timeline, the mystery only deepened. Gene Hackman's Embalmer just confirmed what we all suspected. Hackman and Betsy had been found in separate rooms, and signs indicated that Betsy had died well before her husband. Investigators also discovered medication inside the home, though they soon ruled out carbon monoxide poisoning, which had initially been considered as a possible explanation. The truth that eventually emerged was even more tragic. According to the Office of the Medical Investigator in New Mexico, the final autopsy obtained by Fox News Digital painted a much clearer picture of what Gene Hackman had been living with in the years before his death. The report revealed a history of congestive heart failure, severe kidney damage caused by long-term high blood pressure, and a biventricular pacemaker that had been implanted back in April 2019. It also found significant changes in his brain that were consistent with advanced Alzheimer's disease. The findings went even deeper. The autopsy showed extensive heart disease caused by plaque buildup and chronic high blood pressure. Over the years, Hackman had undergone several major cardiac procedures, including coronary stents, bypass surgery, and an aortic valve replacement. Doctors also discovered evidence of multiple large heart attacks that had permanently damaged parts of his heart. When specialists examined his brain tissue under a microscope, the results confirmed that he was in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease. Investigators were also able to rule out several early theories. Hackman tested negative for hantavirus, while carbon monoxide testing showed levels below 5%, well within the normal range. Those findings quickly eliminated 2 possible explanations that had initially drawn attention. The toxicology report, however, revealed one unusual detail. It detected trace amounts of acetone in Hackman's system. Although acetone is commonly known as an industrial solvent, it is also naturally produced by the human body during prolonged fasting, diabetic complications, or after ingesting rubbing alcohol. Hackman's acetone level measured 5.3 milligrams per deciliter, far above the normal level of up to 0.3. Based on those results, the medical examiner concluded that the elevated level was most consistent with an extended period of fasting before his death. As investigators examined the scene, they found that both Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, were in a similar condition. According to a search warrant affidavit obtained by Fox News Digital, Arakawa's body had already undergone significant decomposition, with facial bloating and early mummification of her hands and feet. Hackman was discovered in much the same state. Those circumstances immediately raised questions. Detectives considered the scene suspicious enough to justify a thorough investigation. Yet, despite the unsettling discovery, officials confirmed there were no signs of external injuries on either body. Even without visible trauma, authorities moved forward with a full investigation to determine exactly what had happened. The investigation soon shifted toward Arakawa's final days. A review of her computer uncovered a series of internet searches focused on COVID-19 and flu-like symptoms. Investigators also found an email she had sent to her massage therapist on February 11th, explaining that Hackman had taken a COVID test after developing symptoms resembling the flu or a bad cold. Her online activity filled in even more of the timeline. Between February 8th and February 11th, Arakawa searched for information about COVID at least 4 separate times before eventually seeking medical care at the Cloudberry Health Center in Santa Fe. According to the official report, the digital evidence strongly suggested she was actively trying to understand the illness she believed she or her husband might have been experiencing. The investigation eventually provided a different answer. The New Mexico Department of Health later confirmed that Arakawa had died from hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare but potentially deadly disease that spreads from rodents to humans. It often begins with symptoms that closely resemble the flu, including fever, muscle aches, coughing, vomiting, and diarrhea. But what makes the illness especially dangerous is how rapidly it can worsen, eventually causing severe breathing problems, lung failure, and even heart failure. By the time their deaths were confirmed, Gene Hackman was 95 years old, while Betsy Arakawa was 63.